going to be talking about the importance of media in the context of COVID or during a pandemic crisis like the world is facing. My understanding is most robust of Indian news media. So I will talk about that. I may refer to some others just to give an example of comparison, but I don't know other media models and content and strategies and incentives like I know India. So I will basically talk about that, and I'm hoping through some of you, I'll get to learn a lot about Irish media, how that works, or does it work, when it doesn't. Just one thing, I don't really call myself a journalist anymore, and that is because I believe journalists should have done journalism. I was a journalist for, I'd say, 4 years of my life, from 95 to 99, full time. I was a reporter. But after that, I founded a production house and we were making non-fiction television programming. So I was an entrepreneur and I was doing more production and putting a business together. And I was writing a political satire show, which I will say is journalism, for about 7 years. But for the last 10 years, other than writing some opinion pieces and conducting some interviews, I would not say I've done any journalism. So I call myself a news professional, which is a little wider term and safer. Then I don't feel the pressure of having to justify my journalism, which is very little in the last decade. So like Hari said, just to give you an idea where I come from, I was a reporter with a news organization called Newstrack. And those of you who are 40 or above would remember Newstrack very well. It was the biggest thing that India had seen in the late 80s and early 90s. I was very fortunate to get a job there. There were very few jobs available in the media at that time. Electronic media there were just two companies. And I stayed there for 4 years and I saw the evolution of the VHS tape. It used to be on VHS tapes, which you had to rent out or you subscribed like a magazine and you inserted those and watched it. From that, we went to air and there was just the government channel, which was Doordarshan. There were no private news channels, were not allowed. So it was a private bulletin on a government channel, which meant that we had to take it to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. They would have a look at the tape. They would say, remove this, keep this, and then the approved bit would be passed on. So I have seen that phase. In fact, I have seen the phase where I was once told, you take the tape because we were running out of time. It had to go on air, and I was running up the stairs. And I was hoping the guy doesn't make any changes because we had no time. And there is beta tapes which are inserted. And then, of course, I've seen the evolution to what we have today. So that is where I'm coming from. And in 2012, our production house started a passion project. It was a side project, newslaundry.com, because there was no media critique happening. The boom years of television media, when the channels, proliferated from no television channel to about, at that time there were about 6-7 English channels and maybe a dozen Hindi channels and scores of regional language channels or state channels. The media suddenly had this newfound power of screaming and calling everybody out, but no one would call out the media. There was an unspoken rule of media does not report on media. And some of the biggest stories were on media. The Radia tapes proved that. So at that time, my former boss, Madhu Trehan, who was the founder of India Today and Newstrack, uh, my other partners and me said that, let's just start this as a passion project. And it grew, and now it's its own company. And Madhu and I are handling it full time, while our other partners handle the productions. So I've seen that evolution. Now coming to COVID, so that's just the background to justify myself and why I may know a little bit, but uh, I'll talk in the context of COVID. What this pandemic and this crisis has demonstrated is that how flawed the Indian news ecosystem is. Now, I'm not saying there's nothing right with it. I think there's plenty right with it, and we have seen that over years. We have seen some, phenomenal reporting and some phenomenal journalism done. But all that aside, I think there is a lot about it, especially when India compares itself to or pits itself up against other liberal democracies in the world. And a cliche that we often hear is this chest thumping of we are the world's largest democracy. And whenever a US president and an Indian Prime Minister meet, no matter how liberal their views on democracy, right from Trump to Bush, they say, "Oh, it's beautiful for the oldest democracy and the biggest democracy to meet." We've heard that cliche too often. Uh, then one must be prepared to also compare um, the news media with other liberal democracies, because I do believe that what demonstrates just how robust a democracy is the price of dissent, the price you pay for dissenting. And the first line of defense to keep dissent intact, I believe, is the news media. If that first line of defense goes, it becomes very hard for all the others to stand upright. And in that, I think Indian media has failed us way too much. Now, I believe this comes from the way the basic model is structured. But before I kind of dissect that, I'll just give you an example of why I think this pandemic really exposed us in media, the media ecosystem, what's and all. There was a very problematic case of a Tablighi Jamaat. It is a collection of Muslims who belong to one particular, I'd say, sect, or they have an annual, or it's not an annual. They have a regular. Jamaat is just a congregation, and they kind of had that just when the lockdown had started. They violated the lockdown, doubtless. They conducting themselves very irresponsibly, no more or less than many others have done in our country, including one political party that decided to swear in the chief minister during the time, and there was a lot of people there. So they conducting themselves badly, but that led to the entire, Muslim community being called out that Corona bomb, Corona jihad. It became this jihad through Corona that is being put out in the country. And some of the most watched news channels actively participated in this rather shameful and alarming hysteria. And they created it, they manufactured it, and they push it till this day. In fact, last night there was a primetime debate on this. The kind of things that are said there would not be accepted in most liberal democracies. No one who said things like that would be invited back on a panel. I forget the lady, I think she's from Britain. She described herself in a Twitter handle as the biggest bitch in Britain and the female Farage. I forget her name, if someone can just remind me what her name is. And so she is not even allowed on Fox News because of the kind of things she says. It is not even dog whistle bigotry. It is out and out bigotry. She is welcomed on Indian channels. So someone who would not even be welcomed on the most hateful channels in their own country are welcomed here. So that is the level of a free pass that bigotry gets. Now, what that showed in the context of COVID is that when communication is key, where effective, efficient, and constructive communication can help overcome the inevitable problems that will come when you are facing a pandemic of this nature, are completely thrown to the wind. It just becomes about this kind of bigotry. And I will tell you why it becomes about that. What is the incentive for that? And that is where the news ecosystem dissection will start. The second thing that happened, which is problematic, was there was no regular updates by the government of the day. Earlier, they had regular press conferences. The health secretary would say, these are the latest figures, these are the latest COVID fatalities, these are the amount of cases, this is what we've done, this is what the government is doing. Because it became increasingly hard to take the questions of the reporters. In any case, they weren't allowed to ask any, but the few that were even asked, or even what was said was commented on and opined on, which sometimes embarrassed the government. Even those stopped on a daily basis. Then they started doing it twice a week, and now I think they've abandoned them altogether. Just once in a while they do it. So this showed how the role that the media could have played, it did not. Now, why is that? Why is it an incentive for news organizations to either take the line of reportage or commentary that they do, um, and why we have to uh, completely overhaul the economic model if we are to fix that, and why India is unique in that space. So first, let's go with the incentives, the economic model. And this is something also that the COVID pandemic demonstrated for its economic fallouts. News media works in advertising around the world. That's a primary revenue source. Now, around the world, starting with their correspondent, I think it started in Norway, if I'm not wrong, and now they have it in the US. And of course, there's the New York Times and WAPO and the Texas Tribune are all subscription-driven news platforms. So their primary revenue source is not advertising. Their primary revenue source is subscribers. But before that, advertising was the primary revenue source, and that is not because the news media system was evil or greedy, but that is what technology allowed. Broadcast and print are one-way communication pipelines. I broadcast, you watch. I print, you read. But this is a two-way. So what the two-way allowed was it allowed a direct involvement of your final viewer through subscription payments, which could really rock the revenue model. And I think the only news organization that will survive as news organizations will be those who adopted this early. The ones who continued down the advertising route will have to perish or do a very quick transition, which means repositioning your brand, it means repositioning your USP, which is not always easy. Uh, Now, when this pandemic occurred, as all of you know, we are going to probably see the biggest slowdown the world over since the Great Depression. The numbers that are already emerging from most countries are dismal. India did not sell a single automobile in the month of April. And automobile and the allied economic activity contribute significantly to advertising revenue. Um, so the only ads you saw were government ads, because every Indian government department has a budget allocated to advertising. Now, to give you an idea of the kind of ads you saw in an English newspaper, you saw an ad about what a predominantly Hindi speaking state is doing to get the migrants back. Now, no English news reading audience is going to be boarding that train, because most English news reading audience are of a higher economic strata. But what does that does do is it allows the government to pass money on to news organizations through an ad, no matter how irrelevant it be for its readers. When at the best of times, when the economy is doing really well, that has a significant contribution to a news organization's revenue. At a time when the private sector has completely dried up, that becomes your only revenue source. And since that is at the discretion of the government, what is the incentive of a news organization to ask hard questions of, or really do investigative stories exposing the government? Because then the government will just refuse to give you ads. And if those are the only ads that are in the market at the time, why would you kill yourself, your organization, by doing so? So that basic revenue structure was exposed in this pandemic, because since everything else dried up and government was the only one left, when reportage should have been at its most combative, when the hardest questions should be asked of the government in a country like India, where millions of laborers are out walking 1,000 kilometers, 1,200 kilometers. I'm sure you've seen stories. Ivanka Trump made that rather embarrassing tweet about congratulating this young girl who put her father, who was, you know, differently abled, on a bike and cycled 1,200 kilometers. Today, there's a news article: 4 Indian laborers have died on trains of thirst and hunger. Yes, of hunger and thirst, because there was not any water on the train to drink, which took 2 days, 4 days to reach. A really heart-wrenching story of a woman laborer going with her baby who died, and he's trying to wake her up, but she's dead. At a time like this, the questions that should be asked of the government should be relentless, completely unapologetic, and aggressive. They're not. Why is that? because the newspaper ads you will see tomorrow will be predominantly from government departments. Now, when this happens, what ends up happening is that your reporting gets compromised. As your reporting gets compromised, the incentive for new journalists to come up for the right reasons, to report for the right reasons, to become news professionals for the right reasons also dries up. In fact, I was on a webinar this morning with one very established, one of India's most well-known anchors and a young reporter. And the young reporter was saying that even amongst his generation, there is no incentive to report because they know through their social media handles, if they are seen as slightly sucking up to the government or kind of towing the government line, there is a higher likelihood of them getting a prime time slot. So the incentive for young budding journalists to become the lighthouses for public service of asking tough questions is gone. So what you end up doing is you're not just killing one revenue model and things at the top. You are disincentivizing journalism down the line. And that is why it's alarming and dangerous. And that is what is most problematic in the news ecosystem in India. Now, many would say, well, there's an ad-based system in other countries. Let's talk about the US. Their First Amendment laws are the most liberal anywhere in the world, and they fight for those, and they will speak up for freedom of speech no matter what. Yes, that's true, but you have to see at what stage of the evolution of democracy they are at and what stage we are at. India is a country which is hierarchy obsessed. It is in our DNA thanks to the caste system that has been the defining aspect of our social fabric for the longest time. In a country like that, the government is seen as the Maibab, the mother, father, the caregiver. So there is, in any case, that intimidation from the government deep in because of the hierarchical structure. Secondly, now one could call it the level of education, or when you have the guilt of one big injustice behind you, one tends to be more conscious of standing up for what is right and what is ethically correct. So, and this is what I feel. However much we may think America is flawed with their current leadership as well, on their the prejudices that are played out, the dog whistles that are played out, it is still very conscious of, like just this morning, the discussion on this young black man who was killed by policemen because they were standing on his head. Whenever something like this happens, it becomes a big deal. It's a big thing because they have the guilt of slavery. That one big injustice, and they've done two actually, that one and what they did to Native Americans. Those two injustices have ensured that it is a high point of being conscious about, or there is a low tipping point for outrage when something like this happens. In Germany, for example, when I was there for a workshop a couple of years ago, and I was talking to my hosts, and it was on media, and I met people at the Zeit and the Spiegel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those correctly. And we were speaking about freedom of speech, and I was like, liberal values are very important. Liberal democracy is very important. And I said, I agree with that, and I also agree that liberal values and freedom of speech are important. But how do you reconcile this? And not that I'm saying there should be the ability to, say Heil Hitler or have Nazi literature, but how do you resolve wanting to take a maximalist approach to freedom of speech, yet have people imprisoned if they, make any gesture which is a throwback of the Nazi era? And they said, yes, you're right. But when you have had something like that here, that is where freedom of speech ends. We will not allow that to happen. So any news organization that indulges in the kind of rhetoric that Indian news organizations, many Indian news organizations are indulging in, rest assured, because the collective conscience is aware that that is where we draw the line, they will not find sponsors. Similarly, Breitbart, Tucker Carlson in the US, sponsors pulled out even the most hateful shows in a country that may have many people who are borderline racist, but the collective conscience is enough that, when he goes that far, he says something anti-Semitic, or they say something that racist about a black man or use the N word, all the sponsors will withdraw. There is that. Here, the very same brands will not withdraw. I read a report today. We started a series on News Laundry called Bloodlust TV because when we were watching what was happening, we said this is just way beyond just critique or commentary. So we started a regular column called Bloodlust TV. And we said, this is what they said on that show. This is what was discussed. These are the kind of words that were spoken. And these are the brands that sponsored that show. And some of these brands are large international brands. These same brands will pull out if something like this happens in a US or a UK or a France or a Germany. But in India, they will not pull out because that expectation is not there. That collective conscience is not there. That collective consciousness is not there. But I just read today in an article online, and we are checking the validity of it, that Arnab Goswami's Republic TV lost Renault as a sponsor because they were rather aghast at his utterances. The article I read did not have a confirmation from the Renault spokespeople, but that's what the article claimed. We are trying to run independent verification of this. We have seen after we called out ZTV, they have lost a big sponsor. I'm not sure it's because of us or because a big sponsor was just starved for cash, but that has to start happening. So until that happens, I'd just like to go back to what I said at the beginning. What is the incentive? Why do all these people do this? I mean, it's not everybody in that newsroom is bigoted. Why are we spawning this generation of horrible, bile vomiting, hate spewing anchors? It is because the two metrics that determine your economic success in Indian news are eyeballs and government advertising. How do you get eyeballs? To create a circus. How do you create a circus? By putting two extreme views pitted against each other, saying horrible stuff. It is like the world over. It's not unique to India. Big Boss or Jersey Shore or, Big Brother will always have more of an audience than, say, 60 Minutes. It's inevitable. In any country, in any stage of its democracy, people are more interested in being voyeuristic. It's human nature. Now, when that is your largest kind of audience engagement device, news platforms will inevitably go down that way. We cannot have a freak show or a reality show where, you have undressed people ripping each other off. What's the best we can do? Let's have two people going at each other on religion or being really horrible, have a debate that is not at all informative. It does not add any value to your understanding of the subject, of current affairs, of economic policy, of social policy, of any of the government policies. But it makes for compelling viewing because it's just wonderful to watch people fight. That is the metric you take to advertisers. I have 4 million people watching my show. And why are 4 million people watching your show? Because your show is tuned to attract 4 million people because it is a reality show. Because you're competing with the GEC, which is a general entertainment channel. So when a news channel is competing with a GEC, it has to get as close to that as possible. Because, back when I was making television programming, I remember the most expensive slots back then was for the Indian version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And of course, now it must be about 100 times that. But at that time, it was in the ballpark of about 2 lakh rupees. That's 200,000 rupees for a 10-second slot. And a news channel at that time was selling its 10-second slot, some of the bigger news channels, for between 1,000 to 3,000 rupees. So that is the difference. So you see, when it becomes, that is the slot difference, that I have 10 million. How do I get close to that bracket of ad revenue? Then I have to become closer to a reality show. And the only person who is not going to give you advertising based on the number of hits you have or the number of audience you have is a government ad, because the government department doesn't have to justify it to a board of governors or to shareholders saying that, oh, we advertise there because 10 million people are watching it, so we get the biggest bang for our buck. So when you say that we get the biggest bang for our buck there, we have 10 million people advertising there, 10 million people watching that, then you automatically can justify it to your board, to your shareholders, and you don't have to justify any ethical reason. You can say it is the most efficient use of your money. You have put me here to allocate money for your ads. I'm doing it in the most efficient way possible. And stock markets don't look at the ethics involved, right? Whereas the only person who doesn't have to justify that to their shareholders, which is the public who pays taxes to the government of India, is a state government or the government of India, who can give an ad to whoever they want. They don't have to justify it to you. They don't have to justify it to a shareholder or to a board. And what incentivizes them? If you make sure that they are seen in a good light. So make the nutters fight with each other, make us seem like the nice guys, you'll get our ads. In that ecosystem, it is very hard for people who are doing news for the sake of news to survive. And I'll just tell you why I say news for the sake of news. For most of the large news media houses in India, it is not their primary business. The primary business of a lot of the owners of or the groups that have controlling stake in news media organizations are either mining or energy or some other financial services. And the news arm of their operation is a fraction of their overall cost. So if it's, let's say, if it's a 20,000 company that is doing 20,000 crores of revenue in a year, the cost of the news outfit will just be 300 crores. So you can see it is definitely not there to add to their bottom line or top line. It's not a significant economic contributor to their overall portfolio of companies. But what it does do is it gives them leverage over the government. It gives them leverage to make the government happy. So if they want, mining contracts, if they want policy that is friendly to them, they have this PR arm that can do the government's bidding, that even if it is not making money on its own, it is ensuring that the rest of their businesses are running well. So therefore, this operation need not be a very profitable or even viable operation, as long as it is doing the marketing, the PR job of these operations, which are way more valuable. So in this landscape of news, the incentive of people to do news for news's sake is very low. So that brings me to digital. So I've been talking about broadcast and print, the cost operations of which are huge. Distribution is a huge cost. Studios, satellite uplinking, downlinking rights are a huge cost. The cost of just getting a license, because you have to get a license from the government of India to run an operation that uses satellite, that uplinks and downlinks the signal, is a huge cost. The web doesn't have those costs. So an internet-based organization just like mine, for example, if I was in India 30 years ago, I could not be a significant player in the news ecosystem. Today, I'm very small. I just have 35 or 40 employees. I just have, I'm a fraction of the size of any of the mainstream or legacy media houses, but I'm a player who can rock their world as well. And that is because of the internet, because I don't have distribution costs. I don't have uplinking, downlinking costs. For that reason, it is imperative we retain net neutrality, which is something that we've been, luckily India is pretty good on. In that space, I think the internet can save news. So while many people think that this is the worst phase of news, it's horrible, it's a cesspool, Twitter's a cesspool, there's so much abuse, look at the comment section of any website, they're horrible. Yes, all that's true, but I have seen it when it wasn't all this. And knowing all this, I still say we are better today than we were 20 or 30 years ago. There is more noise, but that's good. Earlier, there was no noise, but you did not even know the truth. It's not a coincidence that the amount of scams that have unfolded in India in the last 25 years are several times what happened before that. It's because before there was no private broadcast news, there was only government news. Who has the incentive to go and unearth these scams? If most of your reporters are just Sarkari reporters, which is government reporters. I'm talking about the electronic media. There was print, and print did some decent work, but then again, it wasn't competitive enough to really have that hunger. So what the internet does is it allows a new model. People in the internet space, till about 7, 8 years ago, when we had just started News Laundry, were still earning revenue based on the CPI or the CPM model, which is the clicks per million or clicks per index, or whatever you want to call it. When I started on YouTube, a pre-roll or post-roll ad, the cost was around 350 to 500 CPI. Today it's down to about 12 rupees or 15 rupees. So can you imagine the amount of hits you have to get to make any significant ad revenue from Google Ads? Which is why in news websites, you see the equivalent of Kim Kardashian breaking the internet. I had just posted on Twitter the other day, the Times of India, which is one of India's oldest and largest news media organizations. It had a COVID-related news here, and either side of that, it has Sunny Leone's hot pics set the internet on fire. On the right, there was another image of something Hayat, I've forgotten her first name. She's some Indian reality star host who had put a picture of facing a wall, kind of showing her butt to camera and had posted on Insta. So they had that picture with a headline blocking out her butt saying, Naila Hayat pulled up for putting images on Insta or something like that. So surely someone who's reading COVID news is not really interested in both those bits of news. But news is squeezed in between these bits of information. I wouldn't call them news. Because if you have to justify the clicks per million or clicks per index logic, and if that is what is going to get you your revenue from advertisers, you are not competing with other news organizations. You are competing with other websites that may not be doing news, because the logic of ads and the logic of the arithmetic of revenue is the same. Which is why the only thing that can save news is, in my view, a news platform that is supported by subscribers. Because this is like the lighthouse economic model, which I speak about wherever I am giving a talk. If any of your economic students, you would know that this is a classic case of who pays for a lighthouse. Today you have radar and all sorts of GPS, but when you didn't, a lighthouse is what told ships that there's danger here, there are rocks here, don't come here. So who pays for it? Because once it's built, every boat, ship, big or small, gets the benefit. So it is in no one's interest to pay for it. So usually the state pays for it. But if the state is paying for the lighthouse, in the case of if the media is a lighthouse, then can it shine light to the state? But now, I think there are enough of people. So the sliver of people who will pay to keep the lighthouse intact will be smaller. But the benefit is available to all. So I think news has to follow the economic logic of a lighthouse. Not everybody pays for the lighthouse, but everybody gets the benefit. But rest assured, there will be enough people who will be willing to pay for the lighthouse, even if the government doesn't. And those people are enough to sustain a news ecosystem. So it will be a smaller bunch of people who will make sure that news remains independent and will pay to keep news free, which is incidentally News Laundry's tagline, which I like to throw in here. And in my view, the brightest phase of the news media is now. The internet, in my view, is the greatest invention of the human race since language. And it is the one thing that will save news like nothing else has before. So that's about 40 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions. And, those of you in Ireland, I would really, like to spend some time listening on what the model there is. I was talking to the chief of the BBC when he was here a couple of months ago. And he said why their model is robust and why, even though they are state funded, they can take on the government, it's because their budgetary allocation has been done 7 years in advance. So the parliament that is sitting today in Britain can only change their budget 7 years plus, the eighth year. So they don't even know whether they'll be around in that year. So there's no incentive for them to really try to kill the BBC. All the Boris Johnson did threaten. He doesn't even have the authority to do that immediately. All he has the authority to do, or that parliament, and of course, not that everybody's going to vote his way, but even that parliament that is sitting today can only rock the BBC's budget in year 2028. So it will not even rock their world today. So I think that's a fantastic model. I'm curious to see how Ireland works. And also, what would the repercussions be from advertisers if this kind of bigotry was displayed in news channels and newspapers over there?
Thanks, that was really interesting. I'm not a media person. In a previous life, I was an economist. And I think in India, from what you're saying, in Ireland, we have a very paler, much paler reflection of those same trends. Our news channel, RT, our main government funded TV channel, its coverage of general elections has in recent years descended into that, let's just get people into a room and let them shout at each other. But I actually do think there's been a more widespread negative response from the general public, who have not watched these things in large numbers or been dissatisfied when they have watched them. We have an issue, a minor issue of bigotry. Well, we don't really have lots of bigotry here, but we have a very public group and a particular woman who is circulating hate. And the response, official response, seems to be to let her be, because it's not actually getting much traction. But she certainly could not say those things in the mainstream public media. And we have issues here with the media reflecting elite opinion, reflecting vested interests. But I don't think we yet have it on the scale that India has it. And I suppose the question I'm trying to formulate, which other people could join in, obviously people of my generation are used to print media, we're used to broadcast media. I now mostly consume my news via the internet, but I'm not as plugged into social media platforms that distribute news as I would say younger people are. And I would be concerned, I mean, my big concern about the internet is this idea that people see what they want to see. People are fed things that respond to their browsing and viewing history. And what proportion of people break away from that and actually seek good news coverage? And is there a generational breakdown in this? So are younger people more or less likely to do this? In the past, you would have assumed people in their 20s would have been perhaps less interested in news, less interested in public affairs. Is that changing? We've certainly had in the last election here quite a radical shift in party support, and a very, very distinct pattern of intergenerational party support, with younger people voting for parties that were not supported by their parents. And I suppose, like you, I'm not totally miserable about the internet and news, but I'm actually still, I feel we're in a state of flux, and who knows what's going to happen. So I'll stop speaking there. And if that was a question, you can try and answer it.
No, I agree with what you said, what I do know about what you said about the internet. But out about the Irish media, well, that's fascinating that such voices don't find much support. But that they exist, and that's problematic, is a given. But I'm just wondering, the state, how does it fund the state channel? Is it like an allocation that is committed for 7 years, which can be altered by the sitting parliament? How does that work? Does anyone?
One of the media people I know, there's a couple of, I know Daniel's on, and he actually might know this.
The state broadcaster is a dual funding model. Unlike the BBC, it's not entirely funded from the license fee. So, in fact, the majority of the money comes from advertising, and both advertising and the license fee in real terms, because there hasn't been there isn't an established model as there is with the BBC in when the funding kicks in. So every few years, every 6 months now, RTE say we need to, which is the television and radio broadcaster says we need more money from the license fee, and this is a great opportunity for politicians to kick RTE, but invariably there's no increase. But it's an unusual model in that it's a combination of a mandatory funding through a television license and advertising.
I see. Okay. And does it typically, is it heavily censored? Is it critical of the government? How much independence does it have?
Can I come in? We had, during the time of the conflict in the north, before 1998, it was quite heavily censored in certain aspects, like no member of Sinn Féin, which was the political party, which is now the largest individual party in the state, was allowed, their voice was not allowed to be heard on television or radio. And they used to get round it by having actors speak things they said.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. It engages in self-censorship. So as a body, it's like a replicating body of journalists who tend to have specific political views, which would be more dominant than other political views. It tends, the news media in Ireland tend to be lazy in the sense that they reproduce government press releases and court reports as though that's journalism. And this applies both to the TV, radio, and the print media.
Okay, hi. Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hi, Abhinandan. Thank you so much for your talk. I had a couple of questions. One of them being that you do speak about various revenue models that do operate within mainstream media, but then you do have these alternative media forums such as yourselves, like the News Laundry, or you have something like Dalit Camera and all operating simultaneously. So what are the ways in which you would see that, you know, these particular organizations at times are seen as collective? Dalit Camera is still termed as a collective in the mainstream media. What are the ways in which they can become a self-funded, self-sufficient organization to actually give voice to the oppressed, to voice to the people whose voices would not be, talked about in the mainstream media altogether? That's my first question. The second question is in terms of how you've been seeing the pandemic sort of unfurling within India, do you see a particular way in which, say, a government chose to decide to lift partially lift the lockdown, knowing that there's a particular set of people who are being affected by the the pandemic altogether? Because in America, it's very clearly seen that it's the African American population, the immigrants, the non-white population who've been very clearly affected. So would you see that's the same case in India as well, and hence the lockdown being partially lifted, or it's because the economy is sort of collapsing in its own way? That's one of the reasons too. So these are my two questions.
Okay, thanks, Priyam. I'll answer your first question first because I think I have some sort of an answer. Uh, I'm actually in touch with people at Dalit Camera. I think it's a fantastic initiative. We did a story, I think it was last month, on the violence that happened in Bangalore. That story was given to us by someone from Dalit Camera, and we carried it. In fact, they had shot some stuff and sent it to on video and narrated the story. So I think it's a great idea. What I find, and this is true generally with all my colleagues who have worked with over the past years as a journalist, like I said, stopped being a journalist in the year 2000, 2001, and I was more of a producer and entrepreneur. But what I found was many journalists have very noble ideals and pursuits, but don't understand business. I would rather more journalists become entrepreneurs rather than entrepreneurs hire journalists to run a shop that they open, because the balance is very important. I would like to see Dalit Camera register itself as a private limited company or limited partnership or whatever it is, but as an entity that is not a loose collective. I have flirted with activism, and I'll give you the example of my years between 2002 to 2010-11, when I was closely associated with Arvind Kejriwal and his group. And Arvind, Manish, and I had formed an NGO in 2005 called PCRF, Public Cause Research Foundation, and we were doing a lot of workshops and on-ground activism on the Right to Information Act, which is the Indian equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act, which US has. I'm not sure what that act is called in Ireland, but it's basically the right to information of all government. And I remember we used to, bash our heads and get frustrated with the government, and we can't make any changes. And then, of course, the big India Against Corruption movement happened, and then Arvind and Manish formed a political party. I am not interested in politics and have no interest in joining active politics. But the impact that they made in 3 years as politicians, we did not make that impact, killing ourselves for 8 years as activists. So you got to enter the game to rock the game. So loose collectives, not for profits. When you have an economy that understands markets, you got to enter that space and try to make a sustainable model there. So the first thing I would like to see Dalit Camera do is become a company which has a balance sheet, which has data, which has a logic that they plan their strategy with. And I can tell you, there's enough of a market out there that will pay for the kind of amazing work that Dalit Camera. I have seen some of the work actually. I don't know if you know Shilipto Mandal. I think he's a fantastic journalist, and he is kind of volunteering with them. So I've been in touch with him. I think they have some amazing stuff happening there. But just doing good stuff and letting the ether of the world carry it is not enough. You have to have a team, a strategy, a board. It is the most efficient way of playing a sport. You make the team, you learn the rules, and then you play the game. Just practicing on the side will not work. I think that's important. And the second thing that you said of the mortality rates and why, see, it's a very difficult one. I have read many articles, I've heard many podcasts on this, whether it was the NPR did a series on the payment protection program that the US did, the states that didn't shut down. I saw on BBC's Hard Talk the interview with the Swedish chief epidemiologist, because Sweden decided never to do a lockdown. I didn't always agree with him, but I kind of understood what he was saying. I do think that a permanent lockdown is not viable. It will just destroy. It will destroy things that is not even within our I think we can't even imagine how big that destruction would be. But at the same time, how the lockdown is lifted and why it's lifted is very important. Um, I saw the data in the UK that there's a disproportionately high amount of people from the subcontinent who are impacted. I do believe it has to do with your economic kind of status. So I think if you are for socioeconomic bracket A, you are less likely to do jobs that will expose you to the virus. You are more likely to have an infrastructure or resources that could protect you. So I do believe um, it is based on your monetary status and not necessarily your ethnicity. It is only because the ethnicity in various countries are a reflection of your economic status or vice versa is why we see that data. I think it is not genetic. In India, the poor have been the most hard hit, as we have seen. Uh, I think what happened in Karnataka, where the chief minister made that statement that we will cancel trains so the laborers can't leave, and this happened shortly after he met the real estate developers of the state, who said that if you let all these guys leave, who will build our buildings? I think that was disgusting. I think in any civilized society, a man like that would have to resign. The fact that he didn't have to says a lot. I mean, to say unself-consciously that we can't let them leave, who's going to build our homes? Just after you have met a lobby of builders, uh, and not even try to hide it, just boggles my mind. And I think the lockdowns lifting is happening. It has to happen, but I don't think it's always happening for the right reasons. I think lobbies are at work, and that's sad.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. We have about 10 minutes more if that works. So please try and keep your questions short. Shweta, you're first. I'm going to unmute you now.
Okay, fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Abhinandan. Thank you for the talk. And it's great that you were that optimistic about things going well. But see, it's about this market that I've actually been thinking that you've talked about. That, say, for instance, the shouting matches that you've been talking about are the ones that in Bengali, we have a term that says public eat, so they lap it up. But say when, and what is your audience, or what is, say, for instance, Ravish's audience that way? It's a very different kind of audience who listens to you. For instance, they would rather listen to a shouting match than, say, you agreeing with people. And seriously, kudos for keeping a straight face in most of those interviews. So don't you think you also really, in a way, need to, because the middle class, middle-aged population likes to watch things which are active rather than a passive journalist, which is, a journalist who leads the interview but is not really the active person in a conversation, which we have seen, which we have learned, but now it's not the case. We see Arnab screaming and we find that to be, well, we don't, but generally people find that to be, yes, so this is a person who can question, this is a person who is able and active. You think you also need to rethink the way you are looking at media, because your audience is small. If you have to reach this audience, do you think you need to make it more masaledar to be?
No, I think satire is a fantastic way to reach out to people. And like I said, I know the game I'm playing. I'm playing football. I'm not playing cricket. So I won't go to a football stadium with pads and gloves and a bat because I'll get whooped. So I will leave that game to them. What I do know is, even going forward, even that is unsustainable. We are doing a series of, we're doing a series on who owns your media. It's a look into the holding patterns of many of these media houses. And following that, we will also be doing a longish piece on with the balance sheets of all these companies and what is the kind of money they're making. So even with this current model, it's not sustainable. They're doing that to attract more and more eyeballs so that they can justify the ad costs. But even that will be impossible because the ad costs will keep going further and further south. Look, Google and Facebook are going to eat up all the ad revenue. Let's understand that. And no matter how big or noisy Arnab or a Times Now think they are, they cannot compete with Google or Facebook. Which is why I am not saying that these multinationals are free of their share of sins. But what I do find is that they make it impossible for the outright bigotry of the Indian big players to be funded. So if all the ad dollars or ad rupees are going to go there, even the current model is like the earlier model failed 5 years back. This model will fail another 2 years, but it will fail. Because if that is what you're going for, if I just want entertainment, I am the typical upper caste, financially well-off, voyeuristic, audience. Then I'll say, let's go the whole hog. Let me just see, women wrestling in the mud. I mean, why do I have to watch this? You see, because there's something that is so. For that reason, and also just the broadcast. I don't want to get into that. We'll get too technical. The license fees, the uplinking, downlinking regularly, the studios, the real estate costs. Unless a political party or a corporate house is funding a news platform for reasons of lobbying, financially it will not be viable, even with this model of shout. So yeah, whereas I think our model will be viable.
Okay, Jack.
Thanks very much for the great talk this morning. I have a very brief question. So 2 weeks ago in the Irish media, the state broadcaster had a poll, and it showed that most people were getting their COVID-related news from television as opposed to online or other sources. Is that the same in India? Is this a surprise, or is it just because people are choosing to go back to television at the minute because it's a stressful news environment of you don't want to be over flooded?
Right. I was on a webinar this morning, and we were just discussing numbers in India, at least, and probably that's true the world over. The news viewership of television news channels has quadrupled during this pandemic. I think that's because people are home, and because COVID impacts us so much rather than watch news. And of course, sports is all out, and the reruns of films happening. And because COVID impacts us all, everybody just turned to news. So I think it is not an active choice that let me see COVID related news and let me go to television. It's because you're home and you're watching TV. That's where you're getting it from. But I think in normal times, that will not be a primary source of information. It is just an outcome of the restrictions that we're under. But yes, the numbers even in India, and the BARC, which is the agency that gives you the ratings every week, in India, they're through the roof for news.
Okay. We've got quite a few more coming in. Can we go about 5 more minutes? Abhinandan, are you okay for time?
Yeah, if we can finish at 4:40, that'll be great. Yeah. We have, sorry, it's 4:34 here, so we have 6 minutes.
Okay, 6 minutes, great. Can I get Orly? Can you unmute yourself, Orly, and ask?
Hi. Thank you for this. It's been very interesting. I just want to say, I think once you're a journalist, even though you stop being a journalist, you're still a journalist. I was 20 years ago, and I'm still at heart a journalist. I have a love for the media in a way that I think you can't deny, like renounce it.
Yes, absolutely.
I have a question relating to, I think it's relating to the internet and citizen journalism. So we've seen in the US 2 cases of citizen journalism. One resulted in the death of the black man. One resulted in the firing of a white woman, like mistreating her dog in a park and all of that. And those make the news very quickly. And I think you're right about the comment on America is linked to the guilt. Well, I think there's an awareness there. But I was wondering, citizen journalism is easy, and we do have one person here in an island that Aline was talking about. And I think, how do you see it happening, or how do you see it evolving, or where this is going? Because it goes good ways and really bad ways.
Right. So I think that's actually a very good question, but I wouldn't call what happened citizen journalism. I would say the trigger was a video that was taken by a citizen, but it went through the journalistic filters of a newsroom. In fact, if we were to refer to every video clip, and the two that you referred to, in Central Park, she called the cops on this black guy. I saw that. In fact, it was just today. And these two are the most recent examples. So those were, pieces of evidence in a journalistic pursuit that went through journalistic filters. But every video that goes about is not citizen journalism. In India, in fact, just videos that have been taken out of context have led to lynchings. I'm sure you've read about those. There have been a bunch of lynchings in India because a video went around that these two child lifters have come to your village, and every villager got that, and they just saw two guys and they killed them. So that is not citizen journalism. So there is a problem associated with the speed at which WhatsApp forwards go. But yes, I think it is a fantastic time for journalists such as you and me to get your primary source from a citizen and then carry out a journalistic exercise in order to report that. Earlier, our only sources was someone if we knew in the government or some whistleblower or some contact we had. Now we have the social media. But in fact, shortly after YouTube, I'm sure this happened around the world. I know there was a particular venture here that tried to set up a citizen journalism website, that it'll only have citizen journalism. But it didn't work out because there were no journalistic filters. Anyone posted anything saying that, oh, look at this. This is a broken pipe in Rajasthan, whereas actually it was, Punjab. So citizen journalism, I think, is not a phrase I would use. I would say a citizen involvement in journalistic exercises. Yes.
Okay, we have time for one more, I guess. So Daniel, if you want to unmute yourself, because you had something to ask.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, it's a really interesting talk. Thanks a million. Just wondering, I came across a story on The Wire this morning about this gag order that Mumbai police issued, declaring criticism of government to be a crime. And I suppose as a interested but totally ignorant outsider, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on there. Is it an effort to crack down on legitimate dissent? Is it dealing with bad actors, or is it a combination of both?
It is a reflection of the culture of the government not being used to having hard questions at them. Maharashtra has seen some terrible mishandling of the COVID pandemic. Some because of inefficiency, some purely because it is such a densely packed city. I think it's one of the most densely packed cities in the world. And the frustration that the government is facing. It is not the first such order. This is a Shiv Sena Congress alliance. There are various BJP states. In UP, the government in power has, carried out a series of arrests. In Andamans, the reporter was arrested just for tweeting out something that actually happened. So, in case you're wondering why there isn't such an outcry about this here, because we're just so used to it. It's a reflection of our cultural authoritarian streak that governments across the board have.
Okay, I think I'll call upon Eileen now to have some concluding remarks if she has any, but I'm going to take this chance to also ask a quick question. Does News Laundry actually have subscription of Swarajya?
No, we don't subscribe to Swarajya.
Okay, fair enough, because I saw you tweet something about a report that they did, and I couldn't help but wonder if NL actually has subscription.
No.
Okay, Eileen, you're up if you want to have.
Yeah, I'm actually going to keep my concluding remarks very brief because I know you're in a hurry to leave us, and I just want to say how much I personally enjoyed it, how fascinating and interesting I found it, and I hope that in more fluid and travel connected times that you'll actually be able to join us in Dublin and talk to us in person. It's a regret to me that it could not happen this year. I would just want to thank you so much on behalf of the Institute for making time to be with us this morning.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this. And yes, I was really looking forward to coming there and speaking with all of you. But sometime in the future, I'm sure I will, and I can get some video presentations that I'm sure you'll enjoy.
Yeah, hopefully next year you will be with us.
I
Thank
hope
you.
so too. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very
This was
much.
great. Yeah. Thank